Welcome to another edition of Jason talking about philosophers. Okay, for my ethics class, we reached Hobbes. Then now we're in the second part of the class. So in the first part of the class, we talked about the different philosophers' conception of the good, right? We talked about Aristotle and Kant and Mill and their different approaches to the question of, well, what is good? And how do we know good from bad? And how do I know what to do in a situation, right? We're going to put that aside for a second, right? That's all part one stuff. And in the second part of class, we're going to focus more on different ways of conceiving and thinking about the relationship between the individual and society. Where we're going to be getting into questions about what forms of what political systems are just, what my social obligations are to my fellow human beings and to the government that's been established, right? So, okay. So we are going to begin today talking about Thomas Hobbes. To understand Hobbes, we need a little bit of historical context for Hobbes. Historical context is important for Hobbes. So Hobbes is writing in the mid-1600s. He is, and during this time, he's English. During this time in England, there is this political struggle going on between two factions. On the one hand, you have the Royalists, and as their name implies, they back the king, and they back the divine right of the king to rule the people, right? They think that the king is ordained by God to be our ruler here on earth, and that we owe to our king absolute allegiance, and he has absolute authority over us. Those are the Royalists. On the other hand, there is this growing tide of people that are known by a few names, but call them the parliamentarians. As their name implies, they are in favor of the king sharing some of his power with some of the people, at least, right? And they're the parliamentarians are in favor of there being some kind of political checks on the absolute authority of the king, right? So this is a kind of long-standing feud between these political factions in England, and eventually in the 1640s, it erupts into a civil war. Right, it turns into not just a political strife, not just political machinations, but outright, it's a shooting war. People are actually killing each other, right? Hobbes he is a historian. He hasn't yet really gotten too much into philosophy, but he is an academic at this point, and he's a historian. And like I said, he's English, but he's in Paris at this point. Studying history as a historian does, and he hears these reports of overnight in his beloved merry old England, that it has gone from this very peaceful, he remembers, bucolic place, very very pretty and pastoral, and everybody getting along in the countryside. You can think of the opening scenes of the Hobbit movies, right? You know, life in Hobbiton, the Shire inspired by the Welsh countryside later on in Tolkien's era, right? So you can imagine Hobbes. He's got this image in his head of England being this wonderful, very peaceful place where everybody kind of knows their place, and overnight. Just like that, all of a sudden, people are killing each other in the streets. Neighbor is turning on neighbor. People are raping and pillaging and rioting, things are nasty, and things are bad in the way that we associate with civil wars, right? The government falling, the authority of government falling, people being frightened, and people just doing absolutely whatever they want, right? Hobbes, as a historian, thinks that he's well positioned to think about the question of how can we avoid situations like this, the kind of chaos that's going on in England at this time? As a historian, he's familiar with previous periods of civil war, and what he sees is a kind of cycle that societies go through these periods of being stable. There are rival political factions begin to rub up against each other. Then there is often this outright civil war, and then there's this period of very violent chaos that follows until people get a hold again and establish a new kind of government to rule over them, right? And what he wants to know is, well, what kind of government can last? What kind of government can avoid these? Is there a kind of government that can avoid these sort of boom and bust cycles where things are good and then things are terrible? Is there a kind of government that can rule once and for all and have authority and give peace bring peace to us indefinitely? And he thinks if he can obviously if he can figure this out, well, then that would be the government to prefer, right? Looking at any sort of political factions, you would think, well, forget you guys. I'm going to put all my chips and give all my support to the version of government that is the one that can avoid these cycles of chaos, right? So that's the question that Hobbes wants to ask is, what kind of government can last? What kind of government can last? And for Hobbes, this question is basically identical to what kind of government should we have? And if you can answer the question of what kind of government can last and what kind of government should we have, then it follows that we should fight against all of the forms of government. We, as the people, should be hostile towards anybody coming around with us trying to convince us to try some other, left-wing form of new kind of government, right? Okay, so as important to Hobbes and the questions that he asks and the answers that he gets, as important, maybe even more important, is his methodology, how he goes about arriving at his answers, right? He wants to know what kind of government should we have, what kind of government can last, and to answer this question, he thinks, well, now wait a second. Let's stop for a second and think about the nature of government itself. Why there's government at all? It's a strange thing to do, he thinks. Animals don't have government, right? The lion or the tigers or the leopards in the forest, they just wander around. They take whatever they want anytime they want, and they get along pretty well, right? We see it's the law of the jungle throughout the animal world. Human beings, presumably, Hobbes thinks, came from some condition like that where they were animal-like. Why is it they ever start building governments in the first place, right? So Hobbes is very, very concerned about this transition, this idea that we start out with there, historically maybe, we start out with there being no government at all, and then somehow government comes into existence, right? And this transition that he really wants to focus his attention on. So to understand the transition, understand the starting point. The starting point is what Hobbes calls the state of nature, right? This is maybe going to be the key concept in this whole second part of class. So you definitely want this in your notes. The state of nature is the conditions that people live in when there is no government or laws. So ask yourself, well, what do people live like when there's nobody telling them what to do? When there's nobody writing laws or enforcing laws, there's no police, there's no Congress, nothing like that. What is that world like? Let's think about that for a second. Imagine this. Imagine at the end of this class, I'm so happy with how everybody did. I say, I'm going to take everybody on vacation. I'm taking everybody on vacation to Australia. We're all going to Australia, and we're going to go down, throw some shrimp on the Barbie, have some pastas, right, and have a good time in Australia. Let's say on our way back from Australia, our plane blows up. The back tail of our plane blows off, and we find ourselves washed up on this mysterious desert island, right? Maybe there's a polar bear and a smoke monster. Maybe there's, right? So we're on this desert island, right? We pull ourselves out of the surf, get away from the wreckage of the plane. We salvage what materials we can, maybe from the wreckage of the plane. And then we start to think about, well, how are we going to survive on this island? What do we concentrate on? Do we concentrate on rescue? Do we concentrate on trying to build a life here, or huts? Try to get food? Do we try to find water? What do we do? Right. So imagine this. Imagine I say, well, okay. Obviously, I'm your teacher, and back in the States, I was the leader of the class. So obviously, I'm going to be the leader here on the island, right? So I command it that everybody is going to do what I say, that you are going to, first we need to find water, then we need to build huts, then we need to organize some people to write help on the sand and on the beach, right? Chop, chop, get on that, my subjects. Go and do my bidding, right? Now, it might occur to some of you, now wait a second. Just because you were our leader back in civilization, that doesn't mean that you're our leader here, right? There's no obvious reason why you get to be in charge and we have to be your subjects here on the island, right? And then that doesn't sit well with me, and I start to argue. Maybe I give you some logical arguments about why I'm the best leader, right, and so on. Maybe you buy those and maybe you don't. Maybe what we have is we end up with factions. There are some people loyal to me. There are some people who want to rule themselves. Third or fourth parties, they think their way is the best way, and so on. They think we should try to get the radio out of the plane, even though that's dangerous. And other people say, no, we need to find water now. And other people say, no, we can get all the water we need if we get enough fish, and so on and so forth, right? What we have here is we have a state of nature. We have a condition in which there is no law, there is no authority, there's nobody who has, I'm telling you what to do, but you don't have to listen to me. There's nobody going to throw you in jail if you don't listen to me or if you don't follow the laws that I lay down, right? It's just the condition where everybody can just do absolutely anything they want, right? Now, okay, so on this island, there is this condition of a state of nature. Just by the way, a state of nature is going to exist any place that you can't just call the police when something bad happens to you, right? Not only in the condition, on this desert island, though that's going to be my example, but anytime, in a country during a civil war where the government falls and people have to fend for themselves, anytime people have to fend for themselves ever is going to be a state of nature. Also, a state of nature exists whenever there is some kind of subculture who are engaged in organized crime, and they can't just call the police when something bad happens to them, right? If you're in, the mafia or in a gang and somebody, steals your cocaine, you can't just call the cops and ask them, hey, can you go get my cocaine back, right? You have to resort to self-help. You have to go get it yourself, and this is why their violence is associated with these subcultures. They can't just call the police. They have to work it out themselves. It's the law and it's the laws of nature. It's the state of nature, right? So Hobbes' question is going to be, well, how do we start out in that state of nature and then work our way towards government, right? And Hobbes thinks that there are specific steps. He's a historian, so he thinks there are specific steps that societies go through. So back to the desert island. Let's start out in a state of nature. Nobody knows who's in charge. I want to be in charge, but so does everybody else. What can we say about about conditions in the state? Well, first of all, Hobbes thinks that in this state, he says something sort of curious. He says, in this state, everybody is equal. Now, that might sound strange because obviously not everybody is equal. I mean, there are taller people and shorter people and stronger people and weaker people and smarter people and dumber people and so on. It seems like we all have different skills, right? We have different bodies. We have different sorts of attributes that are going to maybe come in handy on a desert island that may or may not have been handy back in civilization, right? But Hobbes thinks actually the differences between people, the chaos and the violence of the state of nature has this ability to sort of smooth out all of the differences between people. That yes, there are smarter people and less smart people, but Hobbes thinks that these differences in intelligence that are really going to make a difference when it comes to survival he thinks these skills and this know-how is really easily learned by people, right? So maybe you don't know now how to fish, right? But if somebody teaches you how to fish, then you know it, and it's frankly not that hard. So the kinds of skills that we need to get by in life, or survive in the state of nature, are pretty easily learned. So intelligence, differences in intelligence aren't going to amount to much. Furthermore, he says that differences in strength aren't really going to amount to much either. That's an odd thing to say, right? But Hobbes is very ruthless on this. He says, well, yeah, I mean, there are stronger people and weaker people, but nobody is so strong that he can't be killed in his sleep, right? Eventually you have to fall asleep. Eventually you have to turn your back. And then I, or some confederate of people, some group of people that I've raised to my side who don't like you, will rise up and kill you, right? So he thinks, once again, the difference is, and we're all mortal, right? We can all be killed. We are all going to die if we don't get food and water very soon, right? So Hobbes thinks, yes, there are differences in intelligence and differences in strength, but all of those are really a wash in the state of nature. The truth of the matter is that there is going to be a competition for resources, right? That we all know we need certain things to survive. We all want those things, and those things are scarce. So if there is a limited amount of fresh water on this island, if there is a limited amount of mangoes in the trees, then we are all going to be in competition for those resources. And we're all going to want to get to them first and want them for ourselves and be able to control them and have them. Right. So first few steps, we're going to talk about now the step-by-step process that Hobbes says we go through. We start out in a state of nature, and step-by-step, we turn to a civilized society. So here are the first few steps. In the first case, in the state of nature, all people are naturally all people are equal. He says we are all naturally mortal, we can all be killed, we all need resources to survive, and that there are no natural slaves or masters. That's an important thing that maybe I didn't mention earlier, but he says on the desert island, it doesn't make any difference if you were, had a royal title back in civilization. It doesn't matter if you were a senator or a lord or any of these other sort of titles. The truth is, once we're in a state of nature and we're out in a condition where it's every person for themselves, none of that is really going to matter. What's going to matter is the competition that there is between us. We're all going to want the resources, and we're going to want them for ourselves. And those resources are going to be scarce. There aren't going to be enough of them to go. We presume that there aren't going to be enough of them to go around, and even if there are enough of them to go around, we're all going to be panicked about the possibility there might not be, right? And then this leads to hoarding, right? So we're in the state of nature. We have this, we're all fundamentally equal, but we have this mad dash for resources. We have this mad competition for resources, right? And what rules govern in the state of nature how this competition for resources plays out? What rules govern what you can take and what you can have? And Hobbes says, well, there are no rules. In a state of nature, nothing is just or unjust, he says. There is no good or bad yet. Everybody does what they can for themselves to get what they think they need to continue their existence. Hobbes says that originally in this state of nature, everyone has one equal right. There's one right in the state of nature, and it's equally shared by all, and that is the right to do whatever it takes to survive. Whatever it takes for your survival, you have the right to do in the state of nature. And he specifies that this means that it's an unlimited right, and you have the right to do anything you need to survive. He says even you even have a right to another person's body if you decide that that's what you need. If we run out of protein on the island and I decide that, well, I need to kill you and eat you, Hobbes says, well, as horrifying as that sounds and is, it's not necessarily wrong in that state of nature, because you're not in a civilized society. You're not in a place where we're sitting around and we have laws and culture. You're out in the jungle, and the law of the jungle is, well, if I can kill you and eat you, and I think I need you to fill my belly, I can do that. And Hobbes says, in this state of nature, it's not wrong. There's no such thing as right and wrong yet. So here we go. In the state of nature, nothing is just or unjust. Everyone in the state of nature has one right, and that is the right to do whatever it takes to survive. And everyone has a right to everything, even another person's body, if you decide that's what you need to survive, right? Now, at this point in my lecture, when I have live students, often, I'll look out and I'll see, some students smiling, right? They'll say, well, it doesn't sound so bad, especially, young, strapping guys, they think, yeah, okay, hey, I'm tough. I'll take whatever I want. I don't mind competing with people, right? But Hobbes thinks, well, now wait a second. Even if you're big and strong and tough, you need to think twice about this, because even though it seems like you're going to have an advantage in this state of nature, and you might have an advantage, it's still going to be a terrible, terrible way to live. And Hobbes thinks even the people who imagine that they might like being able to, the absolute freedom of the state of nature, to take whatever you want anytime you want, those people should think twice, because that isn't really what life in the state of nature is like. Well, what's it like? Life in the state of nature, Hobbes says, far from being the state of freedom that we might imagine, is a condition of total war. He says it's a war of all against all, of everybody against everybody. It's every man, woman, and child for themselves. And he says that life in this condition, he has a very famous quote about life in the state of nature. He says that life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And that those last three words, nasty, brutish, and short, especially have find their way into a lot of political discourse. And if you ever hear anybody say, well, it's nasty, brutish, and short, they're quoting Hobbes. This is, for Hobbes, while we're warring like this, we can't get anything else done, right? Go back to that desert island, right? As long as we are fighting over who gets to be the leader, fighting over who gets to be in charge and who has to follow orders. We can't work together to build huts, to find water, to get fish, to write help on the sand. We can't do any of this stuff. There's no planning or industry possible. We can't try to work together to better our conditions because we're too busy fighting it out. You might imagine that if there's a row of mango trees on the island that appear to be maybe the only source of food for the foreseeable future, right? Maybe probably in the fight, somebody naturally decides, well, hey, I'm going to go collect all the mangoes, right? And then there's sort of this mad scramble for mangoes, and we all just run off into the forest, trying to juggle as many mangoes as we can, right? And we're going to go off into the forest, and we're going to try to stay away from people as much as possible, right? And Hobbes says this state of nature, this kind of state of nature, where you're warring against people, you're trying to get everything for yourself. We all have this one right to do whatever it takes to survive, but everybody has that same equal right that they can use against everybody else, and it's this mad war, this chaotic, violent struggle for survival. Hobbes says this is absolutely the worst conditions that human beings can live in. There's nothing worse than this. This is no better than living like an animal. It's literally living the way that the animals live. So naturally, people want to escape the state of nature. And we want to use our abilities, our natural human abilities, to try to get out of this condition. And our natural human ability is reason, right? We're going to try to think our way out of this condition of the state of nature, right? So, the state of nature, Hobbes says, is a war of all against all. Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. There is no industry or planning possible. And this is the absolute worst condition that people can live in. That's going to be an important thing to keep in mind as we go forward, especially when Hobbes starts talking about what kind of government he endorses. The kind of government he endorses is going to scare us, our modern sensibilities, but he thinks even when government goes bad, it's still better than no government at all. Naturally, we want to escape this terrible state of nature. Now, naturally, we want to escape this state of nature. So how do we do that? Well, we begin to do it by using our reason, by kind of thinking things through. And put yourself in this situation that you're on that desert island, you're out in the forest, you have your little pile of mangoes and your sharp stick, right? And you maybe cover yourself with some camouflage, right, in case somebody comes by, right? And you're just super alert. After a while, all you really want to do is you want to get some sleep. You want to get some really good sleep. And this, most of all, is what the state of nature is incompatible with, is getting some really sound sleep. Because as Hobbes points out earlier, one of the things we have to worry about, no matter how well armed we are, no matter how big and strong we are, we have to worry that when we fall asleep, everybody who's asleep is as helpless as a baby. So what you really want in a state of nature is a really good night's sleep. How do you get that? Well, imagine yourself sitting there, flies buzzing in your ears, thinking to yourself, now, how am I going to get some good sleep? Well, what do I have? Well, I have, a big pile of mangoes that I stole. And maybe you see somebody out in the forest who you were friends with back in the States, classmate. And you know this person, and think, oh, okay, well, I can get along with this person. So you go over and you say, hey, truce. Tell you what, I promise that I won't kill you and take your stuff while you sleep, as long as you don't kill me and take my stuff while I'm asleep, right? And maybe we even have an exchange of mangoes, right? That, hey, don't kill me and I won't kill you. And also, watch my back, watch out for me. I'm going to go into this little cave and get a little sleep. And then if you, after I'm done sleeping, I'll give you some mangoes, and I'll watch you while you sleep, and I also promise not to kill you. So, hey, shake on it, right? So what have we done here? Well, we've used our reason to begin to get out of the state of nature. We do this by making these little promises, right? These little contracts with each other. And these promises really amount to us all individually renouncing the natural right that we have to do whatever it takes to survive. This is the one thing that we have, besides mangoes, this is the one thing we have to trade on, is that I have the right to do whatever it takes to survive, but I won't exercise that right under these conditions that we spell out and we agree to, and then we shake on it, right? Now, imagine yourself in this situation. You're on the lookout, right? Somebody is sleeping helplessly in this little cave. And you think to yourself, now I just shook on this, and now he's over there getting some sleep. But what if, hey, nothing in the state of nature is just or unjust. So while he's asleep, why don't I just take this little sharp stick and just jam it in the side of his head, and then I can keep all the mangoes, right? So, yay! And not only have I gotten away with murder, well, not murder, killing this person in the cave, and then taking the mangoes for myself. Now I have a neat little trick. Now I go around the forest and I say, hey, truce. Tell you what, I'm really tired. I really want to get some sleep, but first you go to sleep. I'll watch your back. And then when you wake up, you watch mine. Okay? And we shake on it. And then you go to sleep and jam the stick in your neck, take your mangoes, right? So this is a neat little trick now, making false promises to get the thing that you want, right? And then going back on them, convincing people that you can be trusted, and then when they turn their back, you stick a sharpened stick in it, right? So we've run into a problem. We've just as we were about to escape the state of nature by making these promises, we've run into this problem that these promises are worthless. They can be very easily made and broken, and that very soon people in the forest are going to realize, oh wait, that person is going around making promises to everybody and then breaking them, and then not only is nobody going to make promises with you, but everybody's that's going to undermine the very idea of promises. Nobody's going to want to engage in them, right? If this sounds a little familiar, Hobbes was a major influence on Kant later on, right? So the promises that we make, this renunciation of our fundamental right to everything, and the promises that we make to get out of the state of nature, they're going to be crucial, but they're worthless until we have something in place. So what do we need? Well, first of all, before I erase the board, before I hold it up, let's review this part. We escape the state of nature by renouncing our natural right to everything. This means forming promises and contracts and covenants, compacts. Hobbes throws around a few words that are all basically synonymous with each other regarding the different ways that we promise to each other to obey certain kinds of rules on the condition other people obey them as well. But these promises out in the state of nature, even though these promises are going to be crucial to us escaping the state of nature, they're the beginning of the glue that's going to hold society together. These promises are worthless unless they have an enforcer. What we really need is we need somebody to be a third party to the promises that we make. And we need to say, okay, well, I'm going to promise to person A, person A and person B are going to promise that they won't kill each other and take each other's stuff. But then what they really need is to enter into another promise, mutually, with person C, and person C is the enforcer. The A and B both agree that, hey, if either of us break our promise, you, the enforcer, you come along and you exact some vengeance, you exact some punishment that we agree to beforehand. We all agree, okay, well, if I stab you in the back and kill you, then the enforcer is going to come and hunt you down and kill you too. So then we shake on it. And as long as our agreement with this enforcer holds, then A and B are in a condition where they can trust each other. They can trust each other because of the looming threat of the promise of this enforcer, right? Now, Hobbes thinks this enforcer is government. This is government. This is what government does. This is why we need government. This is why we create government in the first place, to act as an enforcer on these promises and contracts, right? It's the promises that begin to move us away from the state of nature. But it's not until we have this enforcer that we're really able to reap the benefit of those promises. So we need an enforcer, and this enforcer of these promises is the government, right? Now, what kind of government has Hobbes got in mind, or what kind, rather, is the best kind of government? Now we can answer the question that we started out, that Hobbes started out wondering about. What is the best kind of government to have, and what kind of government can last? Well, now Hobbes can give an answer to that question. He says the best kind of government is going to be one that is capable of holding all of us in fear of it, in fear of breaking the law. That we agree to certain laws are established, and we can trust these laws and trust the promises that we make in a society between each other, only insofar as we can trust the absolute authority of the third party, the enforcer, the government, to enforce those laws. This means, Hobbes says, that the government has to be totalitarian. That is, it has to have unlimited ability to intervene in every aspect of our lives if it decides that that's what it needs to do to fulfill its purpose as enforcer, right? What he has in mind here, the metaphor that he uses for his vision of government is what Hobbes, it's the Leviathan. The Leviathan in the Bible is a big, terrifying sea monster. Anybody who sees the Leviathan loses their mind. They can't believe how huge and how terrifying it is, and they'll do anything to get away from it. And Hobbes thinks that this is the model. He thinks this is the metaphorical model for government. It has to be something that we live in absolute terror of crossing, an absolute terror of doing wrong by. And we have to believe that the government has unlimited ability to punish us for our sins. It has to, and it's not enough, Hobbes thinks, that the government is there to meet out proportionate punishments for crime. Punishments actually have to be disproportionate, Hobbes says. If the punishment for breaking a contract is just that I pay a small fine, let's say, well, then I'm going to do the math in my head, and I'm going to think, well, now, wait a second. By breaking that contract, I stand to make $10,000, and the fine is only, $100. So, well, hell with it. I'm going to go ahead and break that contract and pay the fine, right? Well, that's going to be a problem. So instead, what needs to be the case is that, the punishment for breaking the contract is not just to pay a $100 fine. The punishment is something totally disproportionate. Like, hey, tell you what, I'm going to come and I'm going to take an axe and I'm going to cut, if you break a promise, if you sign a bad contract or sign a contract in bad faith, I'm going to take an axe and I'm going to cut off the hand that signed it, right? Well, then you're going to think twice about breaking a promise. You're not going to think to myself, well, no, wait a second. If I stand to gain $10,000, but if I get caught, I lose a hand. And we're not talking about a surgical procedure. We're talking about just whacking your hand off. You're going to think twice. And the Leviathan needs to have those options available to it. Otherwise, we're just going to do what we do. And what we do as human beings is we try to figure out how to get the things that we want for ourselves at the expense of other people. And the more we do that, the more we give in to those selfish urges, and the more we flaunt the promises that we make and the agreements that we enter into, the more that we are working ourselves back to the state of nature. And that can't happen. That's the one thing that's the worst possible thing that can happen. So from Hobbes' perspective, even though, people naturally, because naturally their urges are constantly being thwarted by the government, they're constantly being punished by the government, they constantly live in terror of the Leviathan, people naturally are going to feel a lot of resentment against the state, against the Leviathan. And Hobbes thinks, well, this is only natural, but the truth is we should all sing the praises of the government, of this kind of government, because this government is the only thing keeping us from the worst conditions that people can live in the state of nature. As such, Hobbes says that we owe an unlimited allegiance to the government. So this government, by the way, it's going to be a totalitarian state, and Hobbes thinks it has to be headed by one person. Maybe you can get away with there being two people, but the best kind of government is going to be, Hobbes thinks, is going to be a government that has one person who wields absolute authority at the top of it. That way, whatever that person decides, whatever is the law, it's not going to be second guessed. There aren't going to be different factions. That person's word is final, and it's absolutely authoritarian. And as a footnote, Hobbes says that the best kind of government that we can have then is a monarchy, an absolute monarchy, a monarchy that wields absolute power. Well, why a monarchy? Well, it's a very practical reason for Hobbes that, well, if we have a monarchy, then we know who the leader is going to be after our leader dies, right? When the king dies, then the oldest child becomes the king, and we know who the king is going to be, and there's going to be a painless transition from one generation to another. What we don't get a situation like Game of Thrones, right, where you don't know who the leader is going to be, and then there's this mad dash by everybody to try to take power for themselves, right? So okay, so to fill out the numbered steps that I was giving from the state of nature to civilization. Number 12 is the enforcer is government. And what kind of government does Hobbes have in mind? Well, he has a government in mind that he calls the Leviathan. This is a totalitarian state headed by a sovereign, a single person who wields absolute power and absolute authority. The purpose of this kind of government is to keep us from the state of nature by forcing us to honor our contracts. And to do this, the sovereign must keep us terrified. We must stand in constant terror of crossing the sovereign. And far from feeling resentful against the sovereign for cutting off our hands and so on, we ought to feel great about the sovereign. The sovereign is the only thing keeping us from the state of nature, and we actually owe unlimited allegiance to the sovereign. We should do anything we can to keep the sovereign in place, and this means that all revolutions are inherently wrong. Anytime that some little left-wing radical comes along and tells you, hey, you know what I hate? I hate that sovereign. We ought to take him out of the castle and go hang him somewhere and put in a new kind of government. Hobbes says, call the police on that person, because and it doesn't matter how mad the sovereign is. It doesn't matter how ineffective the sovereign is. that sovereign is the only thing keeping you from the state of nature. That little revolutionary is trying to goad you into the worst case scenario, the worst thing that can happen, right? So call the police, rat them out. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the question, that's a cool story, but who cares, right? Who cares that, over 400 years ago, about 400 years ago, some guy thought that the best form of government was backing the king, right? Well, as it turns out, Hobbes, as weird, as sort of old-fashioned as his theory sounds to our modern ears, Hobbes's theory was very controversial and radical in his own time. Why? Well, there are some ideas that begin to germinate out of Hobbes, that come out of Hobbes and really begin to get rolling in other philosophers. And what seems sort of old-fashioned and not particularly revolutionary at the time, in fact, Hobbes didn't think he was being revolutionary at all. Quite the opposite. Hobbes actually gets some ideas going that turn out to change the whole world, right? And in fact, even though what Hobbes is proposing here seems to be the opposite of our own modern liberal ideas here in the United States, in fact, Hobbes is the one of the great-great-grandfathers of our own American democracy. So how does that work? Well, good question. Before we go any further, though, the attendance password for today is Tiger. Tiger. So, okay. So let's talk about now the legacy of Hobbes. What is it that comes out of Hobbes that's really important? Well, in the first case, there's this idea of natural human rights, that people have some rights simply because they're born human. There's nothing you have to do to earn these rights. You have these rights, they attach to you simply because of your status as a human being. Now, for Hobbes, these are not very robust rights. There's just one right, naturally, in the state of nature, and that right is to do whatever it takes to survive, right? So, but as it turns out, that one right has these huge consequences for what kind of society we have, right? That one right to do whatever it takes to survive is what we trade in on. That's what we agree to restrain on the condition that other people do the same, right? So in the first case, this idea, and all of the ideas that I'm about to talk about, by the way, are going to start out in the modern era in Hobbes, and in this very young, to us sort of, but at the same time to us, old-fashioned way. And they are going to step-by-step become more progressive and radical with the next philosophers that we talk about. It's going to be very clear with the next few philosophers how they all sort of link together, by the way. They're all in the same tradition, and we'll give a name to that tradition in a second. But so in the first case, one of the ideas that comes out of Hobbes is very, very consequential coming forward is the idea of natural rights. In the second case, one of the political ideas coming out of Hobbes is very important is the idea of equality, right? Now, the idea of equality that Hobbes has doesn't seem that progressive to our modern sense of equality. Certainly, Hobbes, was not a proponent of political equality in the way we think of we want in the modern era, women to be equal to men and races to be equal to each other within a society and so on. That's much further down the road. Hobbes is beginning with what, again, to us seems very minor, but in his own time is profoundly disturbing, and that is the idea that there are no born kings. Nobody is born simply to be king. We should back the king. We should support a strong leader, Hobbes says, and support a monarchy, in fact, a whole system of monarchy. But it's not because the king was born to lead us, Hobbes thinks. In fact, the king is equal to us in this most fundamental way. If we're just on a desert island somewhere and the king then loses all of his ability to wield his power, he no longer has any authority over us. He's just one of us. But once we are in a society, once we are under a system of government, lost my train of thought. Sorry. The king is fundamentally equal to us, and so the position of the royalists is false. Remember the royalists from the beginning of class. The royalists were the people who think that in England, citizens of England ought to back the powers of the king because the king was born to be on the throne. Hobbes says no, the royalists are wrong. The reason people should back the king is not because he was born to lead us, but because it's in your best interest. It's in the best interest of all of you rabble out there to back the absolute authority of the king, because the king is the only thing between you and fighting your way through the state of nature, fighting every day to get the things that you need. Literally fighting. Thirdly, an important idea that comes out of Hobbes is the role of consent in establishing a government. Consent. Remember the beginnings of government back in the state of nature. The beginnings of forming a society were these promises that we made as free and equal individuals. Now, we were not making them from a great place, right? We were making from a place of desperation to get out of the state of nature, but we freely entered into these promises. And these freely made promises that people make, that consensually between them, become the kind of glue that holds society together. Now, the glue doesn't really stick until the sovereign comes along to smush it down, but the glue that begins to hold society together, society itself is bound together by these consensual arrangements that people make between each other. And that's going to turn out to be a very important idea going forward. Okay, so to review that last section, and if you suspect that I just wrote a bunch of stuff on my dry erase board, talked about it, and then erased it before I held this board up and just had to rewrite all of those notes again, you're right. So let's talk about the legacy of Hobbes in summation. So an important idea that comes out of Hobbes is that we have natural rights, that people have some moral rights simply because they're born human. For him, that only amounts to the right to do whatever it takes to survive. Also, equality. There are no born masters or servants. There are no born kings and subjects. That ultimately, in the state of nature, we are all equal individuals. And thirdly, that political consent is going to be an important idea coming out of Hobbes. That society is formed out of freely made promises. They're in the state of nature. The glue that begins to hold society together are the promises that we make between each other to escape the state of nature. Okay, in summation, at the end of it all, what we need to think about going forward is, or what I want to leave you with, is that Hobbes is the first entry, maybe not historically perfectly first that we're going to talk about, and the beginning of the idea in the modern era. He's the first entry into a philosophy, a way of thinking about society that's come to be called the social contract theory. And we're going to look at different versions of this theory in this part of the class. And what we're going to see is that this theory turns out to be very, very influential on not just the United States, but all of the nations of the West, right? So the social contract theory is going to be the essential idea that Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, who we're going to read next, it's going to be the essential theory that all of them have in common, even though they all disagree strongly about a lot of stuff. The core idea is the thing that links them together is known as the social contract theory. And this is the idea that social and political obligations are based on the set of rules that reasonable people would agree to on the conditions that others obey them as well. And it hopefully is easy for you to see how Hobbes qualifies as being in this tradition, under this form of a social contract theory. Remember that there on that desert island, when we wanted to escape the nature, what did we do? We started to make promises. We started to say, okay, well, I won't kill you and take your stuff if you don't kill me and take my stuff, and we shake, right? And so that idea is going to be picked up tomorrow in John Locke. When you read Locke, that's going to be easier to read. It's Hobbes is writing at a time when basically the only books that they read growing up was the Bible. And so he writes in very biblical, old-fashioned language. He says a lot of haths and therefores and so on, right? Locke, I promise, is going to be easier to read, and the political ideas in Locke, who comes next, are going to be a lot more familiar to people who grew up learning about American government. So, okay, I will see you tomorrow then.